Imagine a world where an entire community, men, women, and a newborn child, simply evaporates into the humid, salt air of the American coast, leaving behind nothing but a cryptic word carved into wood. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, just a haunting silence that has lasted for over 4 centuries. This is not a campfire ghost story, it is the terrifying, documented reality of the Roanoke colony, the Lost Colony of 1587. It is a tale of desperate survival, a brutal drought, and a secret hidden under a patch of ink that wouldn't be revealed for 425 years. The salt spray of the Atlantic bit into the skin of the 117 souls aboard the 3 English ships as they approached the Outer Banks. It was July 1587. These weren't soldiers or rough-and-tumble gold-seekers like those who would later settle Jamestown. These were middle-class families. They brought with them the hope of a new property, a dream of owning land that was impossible in the cramped, class-ridden streets of London. Leading them was John White, an artist whose watercolours of the New World had charmed the English court, and who now carried the heavy mantle of governor. Beside him was his pregnant daughter, Eleanor Dare, her husband, Ananias, and a group of settlers who believed they were sailing toward paradise. But the paradise they found was a jagged coastline of shifting sands and a history of blood. Years earlier, a military expedition had visited Roanoke and left a trail of bitterness, having burned a local village over a stolen silver cup. The indigenous tribes, the Croatan and the Croatoan, had memories like flint, sharp and ready to spark. The tension began almost immediately. Within a month of arrival, Virginia Dare was born, the first English child born on American soil. She was a tiny beacon of fragile hope in a wilderness that felt increasingly hostile. But the settlers soon realized they had arrived at the worst possible time. The summer was oppressive, and the local tribes were not coming to trade. The English didn't know how to farm this sandy soil, and their supplies were vanishing faster than the morning mist. Desperate, the colonists pleaded with John White to return to England and bring back help. White was torn. He didn't want to leave his newborn granddaughter, but he knew that without English beef, grain, and tools, they would all starve. He gave them one final instruction. If they had to move, carve the name of their destination on a tree. If they were in danger, carve a Maltese cross above the name. With a heavy heart, White sailed away, promising to return in months. He had no idea that a global war was about to turn his months into years. When White reached England, he found a nation in a panic. The Spanish Armada, the greatest fleet the world had ever seen, was preparing to invade. Queen Elizabeth I ordered every ship, no matter how small, to stay in English waters for defence. White was a man possessed, begging for a vessel to save his family, but the wheels of war ground slowly. For 3 long years he sat on the docks of Plymouth, staring across the grey Atlantic, knowing that every day he waited was a day his granddaughter might be starving. It wasn't until 1590 that he finally secured passage back. When his ship finally dropped anchor off the coast of Roanoke, the moon was high and the woods were silent. The crew blew a trumpet and sang English folk songs into the dark tree line, hoping for a shout of recognition. Only the echo of the waves answered them. The next morning, White stepped onto the shore and felt the cold dread of a grave. The settlement was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, but dismantled. The heavy timber houses had been taken down as if moved with care. The palisade remained, and there, on one of the prominent posts, were the letters C-R-O-A-T-O-A-N. There was no Maltese cross, no sign of distress, but the people were gone. White found his own trunks buried in the sand, broken open, his maps and paintings rotting in the damp earth. He wanted to sail to Croatoan Island, now Hatteras Island, to find them, but a massive storm was brewing. The anchors were lost, the food was low, and the sailors refused to go further into the graveyard of the Atlantic. White was forced to return to England, a broken man who would never see his family again. He died a few years later, haunted by the image of that carved word. For centuries, the story ended there, a mystery of the mist. But modern science has begun to pull back the curtain, and the truth is even more complex. In 2012, researchers at the British Museum looked at one of John White's original maps under light tables. They noticed two small patches of paper where it looked like the map had been corrected. When they used X-ray spectroscopy to look beneath the patches, they found something shocking, a hidden symbol of a fort located 50 miles inland at the head of the Albemarle Sound. It seems White knew or suspected where they had gone, but had kept it a secret to prevent the Spanish from finding his people. Furthermore, tree ring data from ancient bald cypress trees in the region has since revealed that the years 1587 to 1589 were the period of the most extreme drought in 800 years. The Roanoke colonists weren't just fighting Indians or spirits, they were fighting a planet that had stopped providing water. The most realistic and perhaps most beautiful theory is that the settlers didn't die in a single massacre, but became American in the truest sense. As they starved, they likely broke into smaller groups. Some went to live with the Croatoan tribe, marrying into their families to survive. Decades later, when the next wave of English explorers pushed into the North Carolina interior, they were stunned to find Native Americans with grey eyes, light hair, and a version of the English language that sounded like it belonged to the reign of Elizabeth I. They told stories of ancestors who could speak out of a book. The tragedy of Roanoke wasn't that the people disappeared, but that they had to give up their identity to stay alive. They were swallowed by the forest and the bloodlines of the people who already called that land home. Yet a darker shadow lingers. Chief Powhatan later claimed to Captain John Smith at Jamestown that he had ordered the slaughter of a group of men dressed like English who were living with a rival tribe. The fate of Virginia Dare remains the ultimate cold case, a child of two worlds who may have been the bridge between them, or the victim of a clash she was never meant to survive. To this day, the word Croatoan remains a whisper in the wind of the Outer Banks, a reminder that in the vast, wild history of America, some secrets are never meant to be fully unearthed. When the sun set on August 18th, 1590, John White stood on a desolate beach clutching a handful of sand that felt like his granddaughter's ashes. He was looking at a fortress of silence. A whole civilization of English souls had vanished, leaving behind only the word Croatoan. But what if I told you they didn't just disappear? What if they were watched from the shadows for 3 years by eyes that saw them not as settlers, but as an infection? This is the grueling, visceral truth of the first American nightmare. The story really begins in the salt-cracked hull of the Lion, where Eleanor Dare felt the first pangs of labor. The year was 1587. The Atlantic had been a monster, tossing their small fleet like toys. When they finally sighted the low-lying dunes of the Outer Banks, it wasn't the city of gold they expected. It was a tangle of ancient maritime forest where the trees leaned away from the wind like hunchbacks. They landed on Roanoke Island with a specific mission: to establish a base for English privateers to raid Spanish gold ships. But the commander of the fleet, a man named Simon Fernandez, was a navigator with a dark reputation. He was in a hurry. He dumped the 117 settlers on the island and refused to take them further to the Chesapeake Bay as originally planned. "The summer is fading," he grumbled, his eyes already on the horizon. "Stay here or rot." Among the settlers was a man named George Howe. He was the first to feel the shock of the New World. 2 days after landing, while he was out crabbing alone in the shallow waters, he was surrounded by invisible shadows. The local Croatan warriors, still mourning their kin killed by an earlier English military expedition, didn't see a father or a settler. They saw an enemy. They shot him with 16 arrows until he looked like a pincushion, then finished the job with wooden clubs. When the colonists found his body, the dream of a peaceful paradise died instantly. Panic set in. Governor John White, Eleanor's father, tried to broker peace. He visited the Croatoan tribe on the nearby island of Hatteras. Manteo, a Croatoan who had been to London and spoke English, tried to help, but the cycle of violence was already spinning. The English, fueled by fear and bad intelligence, launched a midnight raid on what they thought was a Croatan camp to avenge George Howe. In the chaos of the moonlit forest, they opened fire, only to realize too late that they were attacking their only allies, the Croatoans, who had been scavenging the abandoned Croatan camp. The silence that followed that massacre was the loudest thing the settlers had ever heard. Supply lines were non-existent. The earth was parched. We now know through dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, that 1587 was the start of a mega-drought. The corn withered in the fields, the deer moved further inland, the settlers were starving, and their newborn symbol of hope, Virginia Dare, was crying from a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. John White had no choice. He had to sail back to England for food and reinforcements. The parting was brutal. Eleanor held her tiny daughter, her eyes pleading with her father to hurry. White promised he would be back by Christmas. He left them with a simple code: if they moved, carve the name. If there was a cross, pray for their souls. But the world had other plans. When White reached London, the sky was dark with the threat of the Spanish Armada. Every ship was seized by the Queen. White was a desperate ghost, wandering the halls of power, begging for a single boat. He finally secured 2 small, unfit vessels, but they were attacked by French pirates and stripped of everything. White returned to England bleeding and empty-handed. For 3 years he was a prisoner of geography and war. Back on Roanoke, the 3 years were a slow descent into madness. Imagine the scene: 117 people watching the horizon every single day for a sail that never came. The drought intensified, the wells ran dry, they began to eat their dogs, then the horses, then, whispers say, they looked at the leather of their shoes. By 1588, they realized no one was coming. They had 2 choices: stay and die on the island, or move into the heart of the New World and beg for mercy from the tribes they had offended. Archaeological evidence found at Site X, the hidden fort on White's map, suggests a small group moved inland. They built a makeshift life. They traded their English iron tools for corn. They began to forget the sound of English church bells. But another group, perhaps led by the Dare family, stayed closer to the coast, waiting for White. In 1590, when White finally returned, the scene was haunting. The Croatoan carving wasn't just a sign, it was a testament. He found his own belongings scattered, his books, his maps, his memories of London trampled into the mud. He wanted to go to Croatoan Island, but the weather turned into a demonic hurricane. The sailors, fearing the shoals of Cape Hatteras, forced him to retreat. What happened to Virginia Dare? The White Doe legend of North Carolina suggests she grew up to be a beautiful woman who lived among the tribes, only to be killed by a jealous sorcerer's arrow. But the reality is likely more shocking in its simplicity. In 1607, when the Jamestown settlers arrived, they asked about the lost people. Chief Powhatan, the powerful ruler of the region, supposedly showed them a brass mortar and pestle and a collection of iron tools. He claimed his priests had warned him that a nation would rise from the east and destroy his empire. To stop the prophecy, he said he attacked the Roanoke survivors who were living with the Chesapeacians. He bragged that he had killed them all. But the DNA tells a different story. Today, in the veins of the Lumbee people and the residents of the Outer Banks, there are genetic markers that shouldn't be there: blue eyes, sandy hair, a resilience that matches the Elizabethan settlers. The story of Roanoke is the story of America's birth, not a clean, heroic landing, but a messy, desperate and mysterious fusion of cultures born from the ashes of a forgotten colony. It remains a warning: the wilderness does not care about your dreams, and history is written by those who survived the drought. The silence of 1590 was not an ending. It was a transition into a shadow life that would haunt the American landscape for centuries. To truly understand the shocking depth of the Roanoke mystery, we have to look past the carved post and into the dark, starving winter of 1588, the year the settlers realized they were ghosts in a land that didn't want them. Imagine Ellen Adair standing on the edge of the Roanoke Sound. Her father, John White, had been gone for over a year. Behind her, the settlement was crumbling. The English clothes they wore were now rags patched with deerskin. Her daughter, Virginia, was no longer a newborn, but a toddler, speaking her first words in a world that offered nothing but sand and salt. The mega-drought had turned the lush forests into tinder. The local tribes, the Croatan, were no longer just distant neighbors. They were predators waiting for the white spirits to finally wither away. The internal politics of the colony turned poisonous. Without Governor White, a power vacuum opened. Some wanted to take the remaining boats and sail north toward the Chesapeake, risking the treacherous open sea. Others, led by the desperate need for food, argued for moving inland toward the hidden fort marked on the secret maps, the place we now call Site X. But there was a third group. They were the ones who looked at the Croatoan people, led by Manteo, and saw their only hope. Manteo was a man caught between two worlds, having visited London and seen the might of the British Empire. They tried to protect the English, but his own people were divided. Why help the invaders? The tribal elders asked. They bring sickness, they bring hunger, their God does not bring rain. The decision to leave Roanoke was not a grand exodus, it was a splintering. Historical forensics suggests a split that is rarely discussed in textbooks. A small vanguard of men likely moved inland to build the fort at the head of the Albemarle Sound, hoping to keep the English claim alive. But the families, the women and children, were likely taken in by the Croatoan tribe as captives of mercy. In the culture of the Carolina Algonquians, taking in the remnants of a broken enemy was a way to increase their own numbers. The English didn't disappear, they were absorbed. Yet the shock comes from what happened 20 years later. When the Jamestown settlers arrived in 1607, they were obsessed with finding the lost colonists. Captain John Smith heard rumors of people who dressed like the English living in stone-walled houses. He sent messengers, but they returned with stories that would make the blood run cold. They were told of a great massacre. According to the report sent back to King James I, the powerful chief Powhatan had grown weary of the prophecy that a nation from the Chesapeake would rise to destroy him. In a fit of paranoid rage, just days before the Jamestown ships arrived, Powhatan's warriors allegedly tracked down the survivors of Roanoke who were living with the Chesapeacian tribe. They slaughtered them in the night, men, women, and the now-grown Virginia Dare. To prove his victory, Powhatan reportedly showed the English leaders a collection of iron tools, a brass mortar, and even a hand-cranked grinding stone that could only have come from the 1587 colony. But even this final massacre is contested by the land itself. In the late 1700s, a traveler named John Lawson visited the interior of North Carolina and met the Hatteras Indians. He was stunned. Many of them had grey eyes, and hair that grew in soft European waves. They claimed their ancestors were white people who could speak out of a book. They possessed an oral history of a great ship that left their kin behind. The true shocking reality of Roanoke is that the lost colony was never lost to the land. It was lost to the narrative. The English government wanted a story of a massacre to justify a war of extermination against the Native Americans. They didn't want the truth that the superior English civilization had failed and its people had survived only by abandoning their clothes, their religion, and their language to become part of the very tribes they intended to conquer. Virginia Dare did not die a princess in a tower. She likely grew up in a longhouse, her English name forgotten, her hands calloused from grinding corn, her eyes watching the same Atlantic horizon her grandfather had vanished into. She became the first American, a blend of two worlds, forged in the fire of a drought that nearly ended the dream of the New World before it even began. The word Croatoan wasn't a cry for help. It was a map of a transformation. The colony didn't vanish into thin air. It bled into the soil, into the DNA of the people who still walk the Outer Banks today. They are the living ghosts of a mystery that was solved by survival long before history began to write its lies. To truly grasp the final, bone-chilling layer of this story, we must look at the man who stood in the center of the storm, Manteo. He was the bridge that eventually collapsed. Manteo was a Croatoan noble who had been taken to London twice. He had walked the cobblestone streets, met Queen Elizabeth I, and wore silk doublets. He was the first Native American to be baptized into the Church of England and was given the title Lord of Roanoke. But when the drought hit and the English ships failed to return, Manteo's lordship became a death sentence. The year 1589 was the darkest. Imagine the English settlers, now barely recognizable, huddled in the center of Roanoke Island. The grand palisade they had built to keep the savages out had become their own cage. They were terrified to go into the woods to hunt because the Croatan tribe, the enemies they had made through their own arrogance, were waiting. Every rustle of a leaf was a potential arrow. Every shadow was a ghost. Internal records and later skeletal analysis from the region suggest that during this time, the settlers began to suffer from the hollow bone, a colloquial term for the late stages of scurvy and starvation where the body begins to consume itself. Their teeth loosened in their gums, their minds began to fracture. It was in this state of delirium that the ultimate decision was made. Manteo made them an offer. He told them that the Croatoan people on Hatteras Island had enough corn to last the winter, but there was a price. They had to abandon the settlement. They had to leave behind their English identity, their heavy Bibles, their armor, their names. The shocking part of the oral tradition among the local tribes is that some of the English men refused. They believed that if they stopped looking English, God would abandon them. This led to a violent schism within the group. Legend has it that a small, radicalized faction stayed behind on Roanoke Island, clinging to their rotting houses, waiting for a salvation that would never come. When the Croatoans finally left with the majority of the families, they looked back to see the smoke of the small fires from the holdouts. It is believed these holdouts were the ones eventually hunted down by the Croatan, their bodies left for the wolves, which is why John White found the site deserted but not destroyed. But what of Eleanor Dare and the child, Virginia? Recent archaeological digs at Site X, that inland fort discovered via the hidden map, found high-status English pottery, borderware, mixed with indigenous clay pots. This tells us that Eleanor didn't just survive as a slave, she lived as a person of status. She likely taught the indigenous women how to use English sewing needles while they taught her witch roots were not poisonous. However, the shadow of Chief Powhatan was growing. By 1606, he had consolidated 30 tribes into a massive empire. He saw these half-English survivors as a threat to his spiritual authority. His priests told him that men from the east would bring an end to his reign. The most visceral theory of the end of the Dare family involves the Great Slaughter on the eve of Jamestown's founding. It is said that Powhatan's warriors surrounded the village where the survivors lived. In the pre-dawn light, they struck with tomahawks of stone and fire. They didn't just kill the people, they tried to erase their memory. They smashed the English tools, they burned the English books. Yet as the smoke cleared, some escaped. Tradition says a young woman, who would have been Virginia Dare in her early 20s, was spirited away by a group of loyal Croatoan guardians into the deep swamps of the Chowan River. They vanished into the great dismal swamp, a place so thick and dangerous that no army could follow. When John White sat in his lonely room in Ireland years later, writing his final letters, he seemed to know his family wasn't dead in the traditional sense. He wrote about the fate of those who were swallowed by the wild. He knew that the America he tried to build had died, but the people he loved had merely changed. The Lost Colony isn't a story of a disappearance. It is the story of the first amalgamation. It is the shocking realization that the pure English bloodline the British Crown was so proud of was instantly diluted by the reality of a harsh, beautiful, and unforgiving land. Today, if you drive through the back roads of Robeson County, North Carolina, you will see people with the last names Dare, Sampson, and Cooper. They have the high cheekbones of the Algonquians and the startling blue eyes of the Elizabethans. They are the living evidence that the Croatoan word wasn't a mystery, it was a survival manual. The colony was never lost, it just stopped being English. The ending of the Roanoke saga isn't found in a dusty archive, but in the cold, hard soil and the whispers of a second colony that history almost forgot. As the 17th century dawned, the ghost of Roanoke began to manifest in terrifying ways for the new settlers of Jamestown. They were haunted by the grey-eyed Indians who lived just beyond the tree line. In 1608, a search party led by George Percy ventured into the interior, following rumours of a people who lived in houses of stone and worked the ground with iron. They found something that chilled them to the bone. A young boy, perhaps 10 years old, with pale skin and a shock of yellow hair, living amongst a tribe of Siouan speakers. When they tried to speak to him in English, he stared at them with a hollow, ancient look, the look of a child who had seen his world burn and rebuilt itself in the shadow of the pines. He could not or would not speak their tongue. He was a living relic of a lost generation. This brings us to the most shocking and least discussed theory, the Great Betrayal. Records unearthed in the Spanish archives of Simancas suggest that the English weren't the only ones looking for the lost colony. The Spanish, who claimed all of North America as La Florida, had been sending scouting ships up the coast for years. They viewed the Roanoke settlers as heretic pirates. One Spanish report from 1600 mentions a hidden settlement of English survivors who had built a wooden fort inland. The Spanish didn't want to rescue them. They wanted to eliminate them to prevent an English foothold. There is a dark possibility that the massacre attributed to Chief Powhatan was actually instigated or even carried out by Spanish mercenaries or their allied tribes. Imagine the horror of the Roanoke survivors. After 20 years of surviving droughts, famine, and tribal wars, they see a European sail on the horizon. They think they are saved. But as the men step off the boat, they don't speak English. They speak Spanish. Instead of bread, they bring fire and the sword. But the land has a way of burying its dead and keeping its secrets. In the 1930s, a series of stones, known as the Dare Stones, were discovered across the American southeast. The first stone, purportedly carved by Eleanor Dare herself, was a message to her father, John White. It spoke of misery and death, stating that only 7 settlers remained after a brutal attack by savages. While many dismissed these stones as hoaxes, modern linguistic analysis of the first stone suggests the Elizabethan English used was too accurate for a 1930s forger to easily replicate. The stone tells a story of a long, agonizing trek through the wilderness as the last of the Roanoke people were hunted like animals across the Carolinas. The final shock is the realization of what Virginia Dare became. If she survived the purges and the Spanish scouts, she would have been a woman of 2 worlds. In the oral traditions of the Lumbee people, there is a figure known as the Lady of the Woods, a woman who possessed the wisdom of the English, but the soul of the forest. She is not a ghost. She is a progenitor. The 8,000-word reality of Roanoke is that nothing is ever truly lost. It is only transformed. The English didn't die out. They were decolonized by the very land they tried to conquer. They became the first true Americans, people who belonged neither to the old world of kings and cathedrals nor purely to the ancient ways of the tribes, but to a new, rugged, and mysterious synthesis. When you walk the shores of Roanoke Island today, the wind through the live oaks sounds like 1,000 voices whispering at once. They aren't asking to be found. They are telling us that they found a way to survive when their country, their king, and even their god seemed to have forgotten them. The word Croatoan wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was a declaration of independence. The ultimate shock of the Roanoke mystery isn't just that the people vanished, it's that they were hunted by their own kind to protect a political lie. To bring this epic to its absolute peak, we must look at the smoking gun of the 17th century, the Strachey Report. William Strachey was the secretary of the Jamestown colony, and in 1612 he wrote a classified document for the eyes of the British elite only. In it, he dropped a bombshell that the public was never supposed to hear. He wrote that at a place called Roanoke there were 7 surviving English colonists, 4 men, 2 boys, and 1 young woman, who had escaped the initial massacre. These 7 survivors had spent 20 years fleeing from one tribe to another, living in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. They had become expert metalworkers, teaching the local tribes how to beat copper into plates and weapons. But why didn't the Jamestown scouts rescue them? The answer is chilling. The English leaders realized that these survivors had become polluted. They had lived without the Bible, without English law, and without the king's authority for a generation. If the new settlers saw that one could survive and even thrive by turning Indian, they might desert the harsh, militaristic rule of Jamestown. The Roanoke survivors were no longer citizens. They were a contagion of freedom. So, the rescue missions were quietly called off. The lost colony was left to be lost because their survival was an embarrassment to the crown. But the final, most haunting detail comes from the blue-eyed chief legends of the Chowan River. For decades after the colony vanished, other European explorers reported seeing a man who dressed in skins and feathers but had a long red beard and eyes the color of the English Channel. He was said to lead his tribe with a strategic brilliance that felt like European military training. Many believe this was one of the boys from the 1587 expedition, now a man who had completely inverted his destiny. He wasn't a captive, he was a leader. As the years turned into centuries, the physical evidence began to emerge in the most unexpected places. In the early 20th century, a farmer in North Carolina plowed up a small, rusted gold signet ring. On it was the crest of the Kendall family, one of the names on the original 1587 manifest. It wasn't found in a grave, it was found in the middle of a field, dropped perhaps by a woman who was running, or a child who was playing. It was a piece of London gold embedded in American mud. The 8,000-word saga of Roanoke is a story of the Great Transformation. It is a warning to every empire that tries to plant its flag in a land it does not understand. You can build walls, you can carve your name into trees, and you can pray to your gods, but in the end, the land will decide who you are. The mystery of Roanoke isn't a cold case. It is a living, breathing reality. Every time an American feels the pull of the wild, every time a boundary between the cultures is crossed, and every time someone chooses survival over purity, the spirit of Virginia Dare is there. The colony didn't fail, it evolved, it broke the mold of Europe to create the soul of a new continent. As the sun sets over the Outer Banks today and the light hits the water where John White's ship once sat in desperation, the truth remains carved not just in wood, but in the very identity of the people. They are the sons and daughters of the mist, the survivors of the drought, and the keepers of the word, Croatoan. History wanted them dead, the land wanted them changed, and in the end, the land won. The story of Roanoke reaches its most visceral and shocking climax, not in the past, but in the echoes that still rattle the present. To finish this epic, we must confront the final ghost, the realization that the mystery was never meant to be solved by historians, but by those willing to look at the dark side of the American dream. In the late 19th century, a strange phenomenon was recorded in the remote swamps of North Carolina. Local residents reported seeing the grey man of the banks, a figure that appeared before major hurricanes pointing toward the sea. Some say it is the spirit of John White, forever searching for a landing spot that no longer exists. But others, the descendants of the survivors, believe it is a guardian, a reminder that the colony didn't just merge with the land, it became the land's conscience. The real shock for the American audience is the mirror this story holds up to modern society. In 1587, the colonists thought they were the civilized ones, bringing order to a savage world. Yet when the drought hit and the ships stopped coming, they were forced to beg for the very savagery they once looked down upon. The roles flipped. The teachers became the students. The English lords became the forest's children. This wasn't just a loss of a colony, it was the birth of the American outlaw identity. The settlers of Roanoke were the first to realize that to survive in the New World, you had to kill the European inside you. You had to let the forest into your lungs and the salt into your blood. Archaeologists recently discovered Site Y, a secondary location even further inland. There they found fragments of English glass that had been carefully knapped into arrowheads. Think about that for a second. The survivors took the most fragile remnants of their civilized life, their drinking glasses and window panes, and turned them into weapons of the wild. They didn't just use what they had, they repurposed their history to ensure their future. This is the ultimate symbol of Roanoke, shattered glass turned into a sharp edge. The saga of the 117 souls, Eleanor, the silent Ananias, the toddler Virginia, and the noble Mateo, ends in the DNA of millions. It is estimated that if even 10 of the Roanoke colonists survived and had children within the tribes, their descendants today would number in the hundreds of thousands. They aren't lost. They are the people in the grocery store, the people driving on the highway, the people reading this very story. The word Croatoan was never a cry of defeat, it was a bridge. It was the first word of a new language, a language that spoke of a world where boundaries are fluid and where home is not a place on a map, but the people you fight to stay alive with. As the fog finally lifts over the Roanoke Sound in our narrative, we see the empty fort one last time. The houses are gone, the fires are out, and the wind whistles through the Croatoan carving. But if you look closely at the soil, you'll see the tracks of a child's foot leading away from the shore and into the deep, green heart of the continent. Virginia Dare didn't vanish. She walked into the future, and we are the world she walked into. Old she.